So in yesterday's class and Monday's class, you started getting into something that was a little bit different than what we've done so far. You got to a point where you were ready to print an actual product. And so this is a very appropriate time to have a discussion, and I'm not sure, if I'm repeating something that Jeff introduced to you, let me know and I'll stop. But this is a very appropriate time to start talking about the differences between what you produce in a digital environment, which is very frequently referred to as vector graphics, and what you actually produce as a physical product, which usually winds up being what's called raster graphics. So does anybody know the difference between the two? Vector and raster. Okay, so vector is essentially the mathematically calculated linear or curvilinear elements that you see on screen, or in three-dimensional space. Raster is the two-dimensional representation of graphics that's simplified into what's known as pixels or points or dots. It's basically what your computer monitors are made from. If you remember from some of the older TVs, maybe you don't, but some of the older TVs, if you get up really close, you can actually see the different colored dots that make up the image that you see when you stand further back. You see it in LED screens. If you've ever been up close to one of them, all it is a bunch of little colored LEDs that change colors based on the image that it's trying to display. So what we've done yesterday, or maybe you got to it yesterday, maybe you didn't actually print it, but what you did is you transitioned your vector graphics to a raster format. And so we're not only doing that here on the technical drawing side, but we're also going to be doing it in terms of generating a pattern in Grasshopper, which Grasshopper is really powerful for. And it's important to know that about the laser cutting process. So I think you recall how when you saw the laser, it looked like it was just a solid beam of light that was cutting a smooth line across a surface. Well, it's not actually a solid beam of light that cuts a smooth line. What it is it shoots pulses of light that burn tiny, tiny, tiny little holes that are right next to one another, so close in sequence and distance that it will actually separate the material altogether. So it's essentially a very, very fine perforation that will do a full cut. Even the most apparently physical vector-based formats are actually raster in essence. Did I lose you by explaining that? Okay, so that's good to know. So the thing that I wanted to highlight to you is just visually what the difference is between vector and raster. So in these examples, and this is just a simple Google search of raster versus vector, and what you can see is that this is a good example of a circle that shows up, if you zoom into it, it shows up as an actual pixelated format. This is the same kind of case, but one of the ones that I thought was really interesting to look at is this. So this one kind of shows you, in my opinion, it kind of shows you the nature of, in one image, it shows you the nature of it pretty clearly. So over there, and this is something that you're going to learn in your later presentation classes, over on the left, painting with pixels is something that you would typically do in Photoshop. So how many of you have heard of Photoshop before? Probably a good number of you. And then on the right, we have drawing with vectors, which is typically what you would see in Illustrator. If you're working with the Adobe programs, then you would know the difference between Photoshop and Illustrator. Illustrator is a more direct correlation to a graphics engine that deals with vectors directly out of AutoCAD or Rhino or anything that creates DWG format or line format, EPS, all that kind of stuff. So as a rule of thumb, and take this just for what it's worth right now, without knowing how to use all these other tools, I'm just going to throw this out as a tip to say one of the greatest goals in production is to stay in vector format as long as possible until you absolutely have to go to a raster format. So if you can, for instance, go into Illustrator where you're working with vectors rather than Photoshop, that's usually going to be the better option to just go there and not go to Photoshop if you can avoid it. Something like that. Okay, so just a thought for the future, knowing that you don't really know those programs anyway. But what we're going to do here today is we're going to look at how Grasshopper is going to calculate raster images in a vector medium, I guess you could say. So essentially we're going to do an image sampler, which is going to break down an image into points or pixels, and then we can use that to actually calculate the differences in color and tone or something like that, and actually create a pattern with it. So it's pretty powerful. Let me just see if I can get a quick screenshot of it. So this is an example of a Grasshopper definition that's done with the image sampler. You can take graphics like this, you can do Van Gogh or a tree, but these are all very powerful concepts for generating graphic-based architectural conditions. You can, do full cities, Legos and stuff. But we're gonna do just a very basic exploration of it, and then we'll probably leave it at that for this exercise. And then when we get into more advanced stuff later on in your design classes, it'll be easily applicable to anything that you wanted to put it on. Okay. So, what questions do you have about raster versus vector, if any?
What was the question you asked? How does Grasshopper sample raster images with its format? Its format's vector?
Well, I didn't ask a question, but I made a statement, really, saying that Grasshopper, I forget exactly what I said, but we're going to look at Grasshopper and how it's actually going to calculate raster and give us some data points in a vector medium. So it's sort of a reverse transition, because usually the workflow is going from vector to raster, and then once you're in raster, you can't go back. This kind of gives us a way to take raster information back into Grasshopper and play around with it a little bit. Okay, so I'll stop this video here and we'll move on.